How's it going?
Good. How y'all doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for doing a second round with us.
Absolutely.
So I've read a lot about your mental health issues on your blog on bodyrecomposition.com, specifically about bipolar disorder. So my first question is, what is bipolar disorder? And what are the differences between type 1 and type 2?
Actually, before I get to that, I just want anybody listening to this to know that I don't have any academic credentials in this. My expertise only comes from my personal experience. I've looked into the research, I've read up on about it, but anything I say is really going to be just general or reflective of my own experience. I don't want anyone to hear this and think of it as being prescriptive. At best, it's descriptive, right? It's not. I can tell you what's worked for me. I can tell you what people shared at the meetings that I used to go to. But even there, they made the big point, right? Not here to tell anybody what meds to take or not take, what to do. That's your primary medical practitioner. So this is really just what I've gone through. And because I talk about it very publicly, I have had a lot of people reach out to me, usually privately, to questions, discuss, whatever. As I'm sure you all know, just speaking generally, there's still a stigma to talking about this.
Yeah.
And anyone that's dealt with it, we all think I'm the only one going through this, right? I'm the one in the wrong. And that was when I went to the DBSA meetings. The DBSA is the Depression Bipolar Support Association, I want to say. There's also NAMI, which is the National Association of Mental Illness, if people are looking for more resources. And you see that other people are going through the same thing. And that, for many people, just helps. Not to just share their experiences, but to be look, it's not just me. Because it's very easy to just feel like I'm an F up. Why can't I get it together? It's getting better, I think, talking about it. I mean, right or wrong, when big celebrities come out, like Pete Davidson, for example, who is like him or hate him, find him funny or not, he's talked very openly about his issues. And
borderline, right? Yeah.
That wouldn't, I don't know the specifics, but right or wrong, when celebrities talk about it, suddenly it becomes okay. Anyway, so
yeah,
I was also just going to mention, you mentioned sort of the bipolar, depression, anxiety, all of this going together. Early back in the day, right? The DSM diagnostic, whatever the manual is, back in the day, mental illness was yes, no, you had it or you didn't. And if you met certain criteria. And I actually had a professor once who said he worked on the DSM-4 or DSM-5, one of them. And it's basically a bunch of psychiatrists sitting around arguing about what criteria have to be met. He said he'd never do it again, right? Because psychiatry and psychology, unfortunately, still kind of a black box. So it's mental health diagnosis by committee, which is not, he's never again. Then now we've come to the idea of being on a continuum or on spectrum, the realization that I think autism is probably the one that we think of as most of being on spectrum. It's not you're autistic or you're not, or you're Asperger's or you're not. There are gradations of this. And what I think will probably happen, I think the next model, there's so much overlap in all of these, and it's really common for people to have more than one thing. When I went to the meetings, people would be I'm bipolar with depression, suicidal ideation, trauma, a little bit borderline. I think we're going to end up with a cloud-based model that it's going to be you got a little bit from this spoke, you got a little bit from depression, you got a little bit from the borderline. I think they're going to find that all of this is overlapping brain chemistry. Anyway, so that's my caveat. All right, so bipolar, which is what I personally deal with. Bipolar 1 is the worst version of it, right? And bipolar simply used to be called bipolar depressive disorder. Basically means that you alternate between depression, which I think everybody knows, and mania. And mania has a number of different effects. People will start talking very rapidly. They will feel very creative. At the extremes, you hear stories about people buying 3 new cars because they know that their next big business thing it's too big to fail and they're going to be rich soon. And at the very extremes, people will have hallucinations, delusions. Someone I know who is actually bipolar 1 would start to hear music that wasn't there. And it end up at, and also at the extremes of depression, because depression can be a number of things. It can be from I'm sad to I can't get out of bed to I read carbohydrates to suicidal ideation or even suicide attempts.
I was just going to say real quick, like one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this too is because that whole spectrum and continuum kind of confuses me, because I know, of course, that everybody deals with different emotions and everyone is depressed at certain points,
right.
Whether it's from like a death in the family but it's like, how do you differentiate that from a disease versus just
right.
emotions?
And some of that's where you get into like the DSM criteria, where it's like, all right, here is, an easier example is like alcoholism. Like, how do you define someone who just likes to drink and party versus someone who actually suffers from alcoholism, which is the preferred terminology right now. And like, of the 7 criteria, 3 of them are, their drinking is causing them to suffer negative consequences in their family, job, life experience. It is causing them those types of damage, but as importantly, they're unable to quit without help. And so an addiction professor who was talking about this, and he's like, look, technically speaking, if you drank hard for 20 years and you decided, you know what, I'm done and quit overnight, you're not technically suffering from alcoholism, which is, and like I said, this is mental health by committee, because you end up having to draw this line in the sand that this is the disease, and it is. I am of the opinion, because like, yes, everybody has sadness. Everybody has that there's conditional depression and there's biochemical depression. And like, this is, like I said, the data may not support this. It might, in the sense that if you're going through a rough patch, got a death in the family, broken up with a significant other, job's not going well, you get depressed, right? And then when your life improves, then things get better. Whereas like my depression was very seasonal, right? It had nothing, my life has really been basically static for about 20 years. And it didn't change the fact that every fall when the weather would change, I would crash into this where I was, less productive than I am now, but completely non-productive, could barely get out of bed, self-medicating with carbs. And in the depths of it, I remember very vividly in my 20s watching like TV shows, and I would be looking at whatever and be like, oh, these young, beautiful actors and actresses. But who cares, because eventually they'll get old and die. It's a lot of fun. I really, that, or being so far down that I convinced myself that I was a total fraud in my industry. I'm like, no, I'm a complete failure. And while I was lucky enough to I was never suicidal, like in an active sense, was what I call passively suicidal. Like, yeah, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, it's okay. There was this part of me that wanted to move to a town where nobody knew me and just do nothing and wait for the end.
Mm-hmm.
But then every spring would roll around and I'd pop right out of it. And that's when I would roll into mania. So I think, like I said, I'm making a little bit of it. I think there's just not a fine line between any of these things. But I think really the big one is it comes down to, is it causing severe detriment in your life, your personal relationships, your job, your ability to function, that you can't sort of get under control?
Right.
And again, like, yes, when you're very, had a breakup, someone's died, like you can still function. You may not want to, but you can still go do what you need to do. When I'm in the depths of depression, I actually had like 2 different phases of depression that I'll describe, is you're moving through molasses. You can't be bothered to shower or clean yourself or barely feed yourself, because it's just like, it takes so much energy to do it that you really cannot function. And I think that's probably where that vague line comes in.
Mhm.
I had a psychiatrist buddy one time, and he said the students would come in and they'd be like, yeah, doc, really having a rough time. You know, I'm just really having a bad day. I feel like I'm depressed. And he would just look at them and go, and? Which was a little bit flip and facetious, but he was trying to make the point of, look, everybody's got good and bad days. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. When you've had weeks and months or longer where you simply cannot get out of that, I think that's where you start to get into like the clinical definitions of depression. And then, so again, so you've got, so bipolar 1, you go from extremely crushing depression, which can lead to, suicidal ideation or actually attempts, to the extremes of mania, which may result in delusions of grandeur, hallucinations. It almost, like, if you went into a doctor when you were really full-blown manic, they might think you were schizophrenic. And this kind of goes to that overlap, right? Like, you get into these, even some of the borderline stuff. One of the things borderline people do is, like, they will idolize you, and then they will absolutely turn on you and you're the devil. And there's an element of that to bipolar. I had that certainly in my life, where if I felt even what I felt was the tiniest slight, I would cut people out of my life like that. And at that point, it's not, that's a pretty clinical situation. So that's bipolar 1, is the most extreme. Bipolar 2, I just call it bipolar light. And the depression is not usually as overwhelming. And you get what's usually termed hypomania, where you are still highly energized. In my case, on 3 or 4 hours of sleep, I could just get up and be ready to face the world. Super productive, frequently in a good way, right? And Rachel and I talked at one point, there is some hypothesizing that some of like the super creatives in the world, if you kind of look at their history and their life, whether it's in music or writing or science, you can kind of see like they had these periods of incredible productivity and creativity, and then they would disappear for 6 months. And it's like, they were bipolar before the diagnosis existed. And some have argued that a lot of those incredible discoveries or creations were probably from people who were hypomanic. Mm-hmm. And it can be, if you can channel it, you can, like, this was many, many years ago when I was in Salt Lake City, which I don't recommend. And I had this book I was working on for like a decade. And I told my partner at the time, I go, you know what, I could probably write this in a day. And she was like, sure. Well, 4 a.m. the next morning, I was done.
Wow.
And in hindsight, looking at the time of the year and when I wrote it, like I've cranked out hundreds of pages on book projects when I was hypomanic. I look back at the discoveries or when like a piece of the physiological puzzle fell into place for me. And I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely hypomanic. Because not only was my brain working in a way that it doesn't usually, but oh my God, I could not shut up about it. And when I talk to people, it's like when people are on cocaine, like you're just talking a mile a minute and you can follow it. And everybody else is like, can you please just, can you take a breath? Yeah. So bipolar 2 is the lighter version of it and can be used productively. And that's after much toing and froing throughout my life. And if we can talk about sort of the history and how I finally kind of got to where I had to deal with it. I mean, I'll be honest, I miss the mania. Everyone who's bipolar will tell you the same thing. It's so much fun. I could use a little more to be productive. Like, I miss it so much. And this is part of why bipolar is often misdiagnosed as depression. You don't go see a physician when everything feels great. Right? When I'm hypomanic, I'm creative, I'm outgoing, can talk to anybody. Like, that's when I'm the person that I would love to be all the time. You don't go see the physician when you feel great. It's when you eventually crash. Like I said, and mine was very cyclical. There are different types of bipolar. Like I said, mine literally I could set my calendar by it. Spring, March, April, I would start to ramp up. fall, September, I would start to ramp down. I had somebody at one of the meetings I went to go, he goes, look, don't be offended, but I'm jealous because you know exactly when you're going to run into, I'm like, I'm not offended at all. I'm lucky. Some people will rapid cycle where every 3 or 4 days they will, I think some can even rapid cycle daily. There was someone at the meeting I went to, so they woke up, they were having a bad morning, started drinking, they were in the hospital that night.
Wow.
That like, I look at what I went through and how easy it was for me to get treatment. In the big picture, I got lucky. Honestly, early on, I felt guilty about it, but we can come back to that because I did have it. And that also sounds dismissive. All mental illness can be devastating.
Mhm.
I remember later on when I was at meetings and someone came and they were depressed, they were in college and everything was bad. And they looked around, they said, they're like, I don't feel like I belong here because my problems are minor in comparison. I go, dude, it's not a competition, right? Your experience is your experience. And if you're suffering, you're in the right place. So yeah, I was lucky in that sense that mine was very seasonal. People can rapid cycle. You will get people that are bipolar with depressive episodes that have a little bit more of that end of things. And again, it's like I said, it is on a continuum.
Mhm.
Mine was pretty much straight bipolar 2 as far as it went. Someone else, I've got a new NP. He thinks I show more bipolar 1 in the sense that typically the hypomanic episodes, some people feel are like nothing more than a week. Mine typically lasted a couple months. Big picture doesn't matter. Like, this is like, and this is again, ask 10 different psychiatrists or 10 different psychologists, and you will probably get 10 different answers because this is very much a black box diagnosis. It's a tell us what you're going through, and we're going to cue that up against our clinical experience and try to come up, with the right approach and the right medication and what you need. Even there, I was lucky. The first med they put me on was horrible. I hated it. Kept me from sleeping, made me photosensitive. That was just their first choice. 2 days later, and I would never recommend this to anybody, I stopped taking it.
Mhm.
Like they gave it to me on a Friday. It was over a weekend. And I don't remember the name of it, honestly. And then I went in Monday, I go, I can't do this. This is terrible. I hate this stuff. They go, cool, we're going to try something else. Put on a drug called Lamictal, lamotrigine.
Is
And
that is
that?
that like a mood stabilizer or like
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Lamictal is a mood stabilizer. And there are, even there, you'll see different psychiatrists take very different approaches based on what they think. Lamictal, man, it's awesome. 3 weeks later, I was out of my crushing depression, starting to feel better on a very low dose. They had to raise my dose once, 3 or 4 months later, and I've been fine ever since. Whereas I would talk to people at the meetings, and especially the folks that have more than one thing, they've got a psychiatrist trying to balance 5 different drugs, one for the bipolar, one for the trauma, one for the PTSD, one for the depression, interacting God knows how, and they're getting like all the side effects from all of them, or people try med and it doesn't work, or it stops working. It's like I said, I got super lucky. But anyway, sort of going back to bipolar, hypomania, and what we were talking about.
We wanted you to tie that into your own story of dealing with your bipolar disorder.
Oh, sorry. I know the last comment I was going to make is, like you said, bipolar is frequently misdiagnosed as depression, because I would go to the doctor when I crashed, and the doc would go, yeah, you're depressed. Here's an antidepressant. I was put on Celexa, which worked really well for me. The problem is when you're bipolar, Celexa can rebound you to mania.
Mm.
And this was, I want to say, the 2011 or 12 when things were really starting to get bad. And I went in and he put me on Celexa, and 6 months later, I'm flying, getting myself into some bad situations. I'll just leave it, making some very poor life choices. And that's something else that occurs like in extreme mania. People, if they're prone to substance abuse, they may abuse alcohol, drugs. You will hear about risky sex, things of that nature. I was lucky. I don't drink. I don't do recreational drugs. So like I never had that, but that can be and there's frequently major consequences. My mom interacted with someone who went from being a tenured professor, had a full-blown manic episode, is now and by the time she was diagnosed, living in her car because she'd lost everything. So like it is devastating. So if I make any comment that sounds like a little bit flipper, trust me, I'm not. Give me 1 second to grab it. But I will only say, so this doctor put me on an antidepressant, and 6 months later I was flying, and I finally crashed, and I went back to him. He's like, tell me what's going on. And I'm like, all right, so I just spent this year doing crazy things. And he looks at me and he goes, did you have fun? And I was like, oh yeah. He goes, great. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm like, okay, fantastic. But yeah, he was like, did you have fun? Oh yeah. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So my personal experience, and realize that a lot of this, it's very easy in hindsight to sort of self-diagnose. It was like, there's a book I read years ago called Shadow Syndromes, and it was really the early stages of recognition that there could be light forms of certain conditions. Right early on, Asperger's was kind of autism light or whatever. And you read stuff like this and you're like, oh yeah, I've totally got that. Oh no, I've totally got that too. Because that's part of the human experience. We all have elements of this at some point. It's a matter of, is it preventing you from living your life? So I look back and I think of college, and I would have my phases where I was super outgoing and super social, and then in the fall I would crash down, right? And I realized that's normal, right? That's just seasonal affective disorder, which makes sense evolutionarily, right? You should get sort of peppier and when the weather's good, and when it gets cold and dark outside, you should go cocoon and eat and all that kind of good stuff. But I think, again, in hindsight, I can see elements of that. I do think I was super lucky that I went to school in Los Angeles, because it has really, really moderate weather patterns, because weather is crushing for me. Many years ago, I almost ended up moving to the UK, and I don't think I would have made it. I don't think that 10 minutes of sunlight a day would have been enough. So I do, like many people that are suffering from this, like for some reason at 25, if you're going to have a psychotic break, that's when it's going to happen. And I genuinely had this odd feeling that going to school in Los Angeles probably spared me from a lot of that. But there were these light cycles, certainly. Got out of college, moved home, which I also don't recommend, right? They say you can never go home again, but that's not true. You can, you simply shouldn't. That was, and I was, again, probably going through some of this. That's when I wrote my first book. And, probably there was an element of me being on the higher end of things. When I finally finished that book, I'd already moved to Austin, my first book in 98. I crashed into like a 3-year-long depression. Some of that people run into, like post-project, people who finish their thesis, people who finish a big project, because it's like, all right, I've spent the last however many years pursuing this goal, and now it's done. Now what? Right? Suddenly, that's why some people never leave school, undergrad, grad, PhD, postdoc, because they just, so that, and it was 3 years of real depression, of basically just like staying. And this was the time I was watching TV going, pretty young actors and actresses, but they'll all get old and die. So, I wouldn't wish it on an enemy. I truly, it's just not a fun experience. And that went on for 2 or 3 years. And what happens is, when you're there for so long, that just becomes normal to you. Like, you forget what it is to enjoy anything or experience. You just simply kind of exist, but it becomes your norm. And then something happened, and I don't know what it was. I want to say this would have been 98, 2000, somewhere in that range. And I popped out of it. And I really don't know what caused it. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, this is what it's like to be happy and to enjoy. And I called some friend of mine, and who had been dealing with my dealing with, wrong way of putting it, who'd been with me during that depression. And I'm sitting there on some bridge going, oh my God, I'm staring out at this lake and this sunlight. And she's like, have you been drinking? Like, this is not how you talk about anything. And it was true. And I remember I met some friends and talking to Milo, and like, in hindsight, absolutely bopped out into hypomania. And it was awesome. And then I felt it starting to go away. It was very gradual at that point. And I refer to that as my Flowers of Algernon moment, for those who are familiar with that old book. Y'all may or may not be.
No.
It's an old 70s or 80s book. Scientist takes someone who's mentally impaired and gives them a drug that makes them into a super genius. And the book's actually written from his perspective, and the first several chapters are like almost incoherent gibberish, and then it turns into this great prose. But then the drug starts to wear off, and he's describing himself feeling his intelligence slipping away. And that's what I was going through. Like, every day I could feel myself falling from the peak. And that was the first time I got medication.
So during that time when you're coming down from a manic episode, do you feel like there's a point where you're, I wouldn't say normal, but more level, or is it different?
I don't remember, because I think I went and got it addressed before I got to that point. Like, I was, because it's terrifying. Like, because like I said, once you've been in a certain place for 3 years, you lose perspective, right? Like, think about being in an unhealthy relationship. It's just the norm. And then suddenly you get out of it or find something and you're like, oh my God, what was that? And then if you start moving back towards that, you're like, oh God, not this again. So I don't honestly have an answer for that. That's when I went back. And at that point, I just thought I was depressed. They put me on Celexa and I took it. And something else I did, and this is a much younger thing, and I'll come back to this, is people with mental illness, if it's a biological based, right? Like, we know people that have been on antidepressants for short periods of time because their life was an absolute mess. And then when things got better, they were able to go off. When you have, a genetic mental illness, and I do, my father was bipolar. He went through severe depression where he could not function and not do his job. And when he was manic, he was a music composer. He could do full big band compositions in a matter of weeks. But he was also the generation that, men don't get medication. He was of the bootstrap generation. And I picked that up. It took me a bunch of years to get over that nonsense. And so got medicated. What was I completely forgot where I was going with this.
Alexa, you started taking.
Right, so they put me on Celexa, which is just a plain, I know what I was going to say is, what a lot of people do is they take the meds till they feel better, and then they quit. Because they go, I'm fixed, I'm cured. And if it is biological or genetic, it's not. And that's what I did. I took it for a month, felt great, never followed up with my doctor, did literally everything you're not supposed to do, because I didn't know any better. And then, again, I go through my 30s and, had another couple of years. That was the time where I was like, kind of out of the blue, I was like, I'm going to move to Salt Lake City and pursue ice speed skating, because I'd been an inline skater for years, realized that this was like something I'd wanted to do for many years. It wasn't truly here's a sport I've never done. I'd done a related sport. I'm living in Austin. I'm doing very little with my life. If I don't go, I'll regret it, because I can do my job, whatever it is, anywhere I can plug in the internet. So did that, spent 5.5 years there. And again, I look back and see elements of that, where during the fall, where it would get very gray, I would start to crater. And then in the spring, I would get very vocally combative with my coach, which is something that happens when you're manic. Because you go from just thinking that you're right about everything to knowing that you're right about everything, and you really won't listen to anybody. And so, and I was in a relationship and they were kind of watching this happen. It was still workable, right? That was when I wrote that book in like 18 hours, right? Like, channeled, it can be awesome. So I get done in Salt Lake City in 2010. And I was actually supposed to go to the UK to pursue a relationship. And this had been on the books for a couple of years. And I went back to Nashville briefly, which is where I'm from, and kind of decided, nope, can't do it. And there were other factors like the relationship wasn't really going well and we weren't compatible. Like it wasn't just the mania, but bipolar, the statistics, it just destroys relationships. It just does. That was actually why my mother and father got divorced, was he would fall into these depressions and he wouldn't address it or get treatment, and she just couldn't handle it, right? Like they were great friends afterwards, but it will just blow up relationships at both ends. Because when you're depressed and can't get out of bed and can't function, I mean, I didn't want to be around me when I was like that. And then when you're manic, you can be so ridiculously over the top or spending all your money because, you know what, this is it. This is going to be the one that makes us millions. And you spend your entire life savings, and I'm getting to that. So I finished Salt Lake, go back to Nashville, decided I cannot go to the UK, moved back to Austin, where I had a lot of baggage and history of earlier bad environments that I had been involved in, and I'll just leave it at that. And of course, I got sucked right back into them because habits will be habits. And that's when it really started to accelerate. And I can look back at that because it's a little more occurrence where every spring I would jump into another really unhealthy personal relationship. And that would go great until I cratered into depression. And then I would just shut down and be completely a horrible human being. And that would blow up that relationship until the next spring, rinse and repeat. Like I said, and I got involved in some fairly unhealthy environments and some poor life choices, and I'll just leave it at that because that's kind of all that's needed. And this culminated, and at that point, like I basically quit caring about the fitness industry because to a very first approximation, my whole interest in this was to make myself a better athlete. And when I retired at the age of 42, I did my last skate race. I finally closed off this career by achieving a goal I'd wanted to achieve in my 20s. I'm like, I'm done. And when I retired, I no longer cared. And I mean, luckily the books were, my books still sold in the background, but I did no writing, I did no reading. I just got involved in these very bad environments. So 2014 rolls around. And that spring, again, jumped into an incredibly unhealthy relationship that through just a number of crazy happenstances would put me in a situation about August of that year to do something completely rational. As someone who's been in the fitness industry, who is a scientifically based writer, who has an author, it made perfect sense for me to buy a nightclub that was failing. What could go wrong, right? I mean, who better than me? No, like dead serious.
Yeah.
And the long and the short of it, and I mean, I was completely out of control. I mean, at one point in my life, I literally didn't speak to my mom for a year because she said something to me I didn't like. And I was just like, we're done. I cut friends out of my life. I said some truly horrible things to truly close people to me. I lost my mentor. I screwed things up at the Humane Society where I've been volunteering, walking dogs. Guys, out, stop it. Like I said, it did a lot of damage, much of which I was not able after the fact to repair. And so that happened. And, that lasted about, I think, 6-8 weeks before things finally, and that was right about the time the weather was changing. And it was obvious that it was not actually too big to fail, that there was no chance of saving it. And that's when I crashed. Now, at this point, it was no longer a gradual fall. It was literally overnight for me. And it's like falling off a cliff. And I'll come back to that too when I talk about the treatment I got. And I just gave up because I'm like, this is done. There's nothing that can be done. We made it a few more days and I just sort of disappeared. And we just let everybody know, sorry, we're done. Doors are closed, nothing we can do. Okay. And the long and the short of it, and this would have been, it was actually October, I remember, because we actually had one good night on Halloween. And then the next week we closed the doors. And because of me doing this, basically, throwing good money at bad, the long and the short of it was I basically lost, I lost my entire life savings in a span of 8 weeks. that I've been building up for years. And at that point, and my mom had been following this, and she was, that's when she started going to meetings, trying to get more information, because at that point, you won't listen to anybody. When you're that far gone, once you get past a certain point, nobody can talk to you. And I hit bottom. I went back to Nashville, and I was lucky, at least I had a support network. Not everybody does. Some people's families are not willing. You hear all kinds of horrible stories about people whose family is just like, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with you. Luckily, I've got a very close-knit family. Got very lucky to get into a very scientifically based treatment center in Nashville called the Center for Hope and Healing. Went in, and I mean, you have to realize that, so my depression has 2 stages. Stage 1, when I crash completely, is like, can't get out of bed for 14 hours depressed. Like it's like literally you cannot function as a human being because you are moving through molasses. So you just sleep all day. And then when I finally come out of that, even on my own, it gets to where like, okay, I can at least, bathe or feed myself, but I'm still not doing really well. And I was there. Driving home was just nightmarish, having to do a 14-hour drive when I could barely function. Get home, they get me into treatment, go through the intake and all of that. And they're like, yep, definitely bipolar 2. Put me on the first drug, whose name I forget. I also, they had a therapist there that my mom took me to the therapist she'd been seeing, and he and I were not a good fit for reasons that are not worth sharing. And the therapist that was at this center, he and I just clicked instantly. Just loved the guy because he was just straight to the point, foul mouth, didn't care. I absolutely loved him. I've talked to him since then. He's one of those guys that if I'd met him outside the clinical setting, we would have just been best buddies. So they get me medicated. We started also going to the meetings. Like I said, DBSA has support meetings all over the country. I don't know if they're international, and they don't have them everywhere. Just again, to be able to share experiences and see what other people are going through. And I do, for people going through this, I cannot recommend it too much, because frequently people that have been experiencing this for years, they have experience with who's a good therapist, who's a good psychiatrist, who's a bad psychiatrist who won't work with you. They've had different experience with their own medications. Like I said, was never there to go, you should or shouldn't be doing this. But being able to share in a safe, in a safe space, it's why you'll notice I don't use names, I don't use specifics. This is just because that was all shared in privacy, for lack of, I guess I can't think of the word I want, and started going to meetings twice a week. I was going to my therapist twice a week, got, seeing my NP. They put me on Lamictal, which, like I said, is a mood stabilizer, and it has to be titrated up for a few weeks because otherwise you can get some percentage gets a really weird rash from it. I don't know why. And I was still dealing even then with the aftermath of the Austin night. Like I was still having to deal with paperwork. And it was great when the folks, the people at the Austin Tax Bureau was like, you haven't filed employee tax work in 5 years, because I bought it from somebody who'd been running into the ground. And I'm like, just what I wanted to deal with when I can barely get out of bed, to have to go deal with this guy, facing the possibility of having to file bankruptcy, all these people, all these creditors, like not really what you want to be dealing with when you can't get out of bed. So I'm having to deal with that to the best of my ability. And like I said, real lucky, good support network. I mean, I had to take my dogs home with me. The energy it takes to just take your dogs out, but I had to, because they had to go, and at least it put me outside. But Nashville has bad winters, so like that, I tried light boxes, I tried all of this. Luckily, the medication starts to kick in finally about week 3, and I just feel myself kind of rising through stage 1 depression, where I can at least function, and then back to some sense of, okay, I'm not completely clinically depressed, I can function now. So that's about the time I started, when I was going to the meetings, and I felt guilty because I'm seeing these people dealing with 5 comorbid disorders, one of them who hadn't opened his mail for a year. And I went through that too. When I would get depressed, you get late bills, and then you get the anxiety from not wanting, because you know how bad it's going to be. But you know that deep down, if you don't open it, it's going to be worse next, and the mail just stacks up because you just can't You just can't deal. He hadn't opened his mail in over a year. And I'm looking at that going, they put me on one med and I'm fine now. I need to just stop being a big old baby whiner. And my mom's like, you can't think like that. And I'm not, trust me, it's not the way to think. She goes, you have to think of it like, look, yeah, you got lucky, but this can give folks hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel, right? And I've been back since, and some of the folks that couple years before, they have gotten better. They have made progress. So yes, I'm going to that, and basically, because what else was I going to do other than walk my dogs and goof around on the internet and go to therapy and see my nurse practitioner? And I learned several good things. This is actually from my therapist, because I was also at this point in my life. I was 44. I had retired from sport, which had basically been, my life existence since I was 16. I had essentially retired from the field that was the only thing that I knew. And it was about, it might have well have been sort of a midlife crisis, because I'm now looking at this going, what am I going to do? I mean, I had just lost every penny I had. And actually a cousin of mine, an aunt who was helping my mom with this, actually said, I hope he loses it all. I hope he loses it all. And as horrible as it was in hindsight, as much as I wish I hadn't gone through it, I think if I hadn't hit rock bottom, I wouldn't have sought help, because I'm like, I don't ever want this to happen again. Because the other ones were mild enough, right? It was never quite that climactic at the end, that I think if I hadn't done that, it would have been a couple more years where it eventually was, because it did accelerate over the years. And there is even research, every time you cycle from depression to mania, it leaves traces in the brain, and it does get worse over time. So this was when it finally truly blew me out. Thankfully, I had book sales, so at least I had some income, but I'm like, I don't know what to do. How do I pick a new career? I was reading all those articles, like, how to change directions in life when you're 50, because people do it. I had a friend who went through it, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make the money back what if I have to declare bankruptcy? I had all the paperwork. I had to go get it was nightmarish, because for 4 years I'm facing is the people that I signed the lease with, who they are predatory. They knew that they owned that building and knew that everything in it always failed. They didn't care. They let you sign a lease. They got their rent no matter what. But I'm like, are they going to come after me to squeeze water out of a rock? Like, I got nothing to give them, all this other stuff. But I think if I hadn't truly hit bottom, I wouldn't have gone and gotten help and gotten medicated. So a couple things that my therapist shared with me. One, he goes, look, you're going to go through something, GSR, guilt, shame, and regret. And I still am to that. He's like, you're going to look back at that and go, how could I have done that? How? What in the hell was I thinking? And the answer is that you're not rational. I've actually looked at the research. Bipolar hijacks the frontal cortex, the part of our brain that makes us self-aware, and you just run on impulse.
That's what happened
during mania. Yes, during mania is just like suddenly you go from being able to sort of make reasoned choices to, again, you're like, I'm going to buy a plane because my new project is too big to fail. I'm going to buy a nightclub because what could go wrong? Well, a lot, actually.